Good to go.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone who has come out on this cold, rainy day to continue our search for the meaning of Jesus' miracles. And as you will remember, last Sunday, because of my poor management of time, we interrupted the story of the Gerasene demoniac at the crucial moment, the turning point in the encounter between Jesus and this poor possessed man. The turning point comes with the discovery of the name of the demon in Mark chapter 5, verse 9. Jesus asks for the name, and the name turns out to be Legion, Legion. It is, of course, a Roman military term. A legion, a Roman legion at full strength, was between 4,000 and 5,000 people. So this poor man is absolutely swarming with spirits. And the fact that he identifies, the fact that the demon gives Legion as the name of the spirits possessing him, gives to this story a clear political resonance. In fact, it turns out that we know a lot about the Roman legion that occupied Palestine in the first century. It was Legion number 10 Fretensis. And you may not be surprised to know that the legionary banner, the emblem that this legion carried into battle, depicted, can you guess? A wild boar. A wild boar. Now, that's ironic, isn't it? Because the demons go out of this poor man and they go into the pigs. But this story, with its political context, reflects an awareness of the connection between Roman imperialism on the one hand and the suffering of individuals. Jim, there is a psychologist. I don't think he's alive anymore, but his name is Frantz Fanon, and you probably know his work. And he has called attention to this connection between the political and the individual. He refers to it as the colonization of the mind. The colonization of the mind of subjugated peoples. So this exorcism story conveys an understanding of the fact that the liberation of oppressed individuals has or can have a political component. In this case, it is the expulsion, the longed for expulsion of the occupying Roman army. Now, you know, of course, how the story continues. The legion of demons begs Jesus not to send them out of the country like the occupying Roman army. They want to remain in the territory. And so they ask Jesus to send us into that swine herd over there. Jesus gives them permission, and the unclean spirits come out of the man and they go into the swineherd, numbering about 2,000 pigs. The swineherd runs down a steep bank into the sea and is drowned. Now, I want to focus upon the reaction of the people of Gerasa. So, when the swineherd, which is probably a communal herd in which people have invested and they have hired some swineherds to take care of the possession. So the stock market has just crashed in Gerasa, and the swineherds run off to the city to report what has happened. And so the people come out of Gerasa and they see Jesus and the formerly demon-possessed man sitting there clothed and in his right mind. And it says that the people were afraid. Do you see that? And they began to beg Jesus to leave their neighborhood, take your ministry of liberation and go someplace else. And then at the very end of the story, as Jesus is getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed by the demons begged Jesus to be allowed to stay with him. He wants to become a disciple. And Jesus replies, "Go home and tell your friends how much the Lord has done for you and what mercy the Lord has shown you." Now, of course, there are political and economic aspects of this story, but I want to focus our attention here at the end of this story upon the spiritual and psychological response of the people of Gerasa. It is interesting to me that the response of the people mirrors that of the demon-possessed man in a number of ways. Like the demon, the townspeople are initially drawn to Jesus. Almost against their will, they come running out of the city. Like the demon, their overriding reaction is one of fear, which causes them to plead with Jesus to depart from their neighborhood, to leave them alone. And just as the demon desired to stay in possession of the territory, the townspeople want to expel Jesus so that they remain in control of their territory. So despite the fact that Jesus has liberated one of the oppressed dwellers of this region, the townspeople drive him away. Well, this feature of the story, I think, must have communicated, it must have reverberated with the experience of the early followers of Jesus. Jesus' followers, I think, were well aware that their actions on behalf of suffering people would sometimes be met with rejection. But Jesus' rejection by the Gerasenes is not the last word in the story. As opposed to the townspeople, the demon-possessed man begs that he be allowed to remain with Jesus. And even though Jesus refuses to add him to the group of the disciples, Jesus gives the man a task that is well suited to him. He says, go home and tell your own people what the Lord has done. Now, presumably, his own people are Gentiles. And so, don't you think it is wonderful that this formerly demon-possessed man, who is now in his right mind, may have been the first missionary to the Gentiles? Okay, now I would like to try with your help to draw out the meaning of this story for us. What do we learn from Jesus' liberating action? I think we learn at least three things. Number one, Jesus does not turn away from this broken, haunted, tortured person. He does not turn away from him. That's difficult, isn't it? Any of us who have been involved in trying to help some of our friends, some members of our church recover from a deep loss, a grief, the first temptation is to turn away, to close ourselves off, to protect ourselves from the hurt and the grief. But notice that Jesus does not do that. Number two, the second meaning that I find in this story is that Jesus learns the name of the spirit of oppression. And I think, colleagues, that we today have to become fearless. We have to become unafraid to name the spirits of oppression in our own time. We must not be afraid to name it. Whether those spirits of oppression in our society are pornography, or a gambling addiction, or drug use, or lies and deceptions that manipulate and fool people, we have to be able to name it. We won't be able to expel the demon unless we have the courage to name it. And our predecessors, during the Hitler time in Germany, courageous people like Walter Luther, a pastor, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and others, who created the Confessing Church, Die Bekennende Kirche, in opposition to Hitler's attempt to appropriate Christianity. Those people they found the courage to name the spirits of oppression. And of course, a number of those courageous people paid a high cost. They paid a high price. Finally, the third lesson that I draw from this story is that Jesus engages in a battle of wits with the demon, with the force of oppression. Rudolf Bultmann, my academic great-grandfather, if you come to my office at Fordham University, or if you come to my home when I retire sometime in 2025, I will show you a wonderful picture that I have of Rudolf Bultmann, larger than life, given to me by the publisher, Mohr Siebeck. And Bultmann proposed that Jesus had tricked the demon. That's his interpretation. Jesus used his intelligence to outwit the demon. as they engaged in exorcistic combat. And so I think the lesson for us today is that in our attempt to liberate people from the forces of oppression, we have to summon every resource, intellectual resource. We have to be, what did Jesus say? Wiser than what? Serpents, and harmless as doves. Okay, let me pause there for a few minutes before we move on to the so-called nature miracles. Let me pause for a minute and see if any members of our class have discovered other meanings in this story that I have not drawn out.
Larry?
Yes,
John,
please.
Three things come to mind before we leave this. One, Jesus, of course, had said that he was going to the people of Israel for his work. And if memory serves me right, it's been years. I think some of the original tribes of Judah, of Jacob, settled on that side of the sea.
Yes.
So they could have been long lost Israelites.
Yes.
Two, I think the people wanted Jesus to get out of there before he did more economic harm to them. And
Yes.
point number three, the guy that was cured said he wanted to get on the boat and get away before they went after him.
Those are all wonderful points, and I think fully appropriate. This story is full of irony, and it's full of sharp-witted political humor. So I think all 3 points that you're making are valid. Whoever told this story, the storytellers are probably Jewish, because they connect the demons with what? Pigs, unclean animals. So I think your suspicion that these are some long lost Israelites living on the east side of Jordan who held on to the story, who retained the memory of what Jesus did when he briefly crossed over into Gentile territory. Thank you for those good points.
Larry?
Others? Comments,
Evan,
questions?
Evan, there is a word that pops out as A-D-J-U-R-E, adjure. When the demon, that word is used to portray how he talks to Jesus, and he talks to him, that word as being an equal. And Jesus recognizes that he's not gonna have to let that stand. And he takes over and basically has to do what he did with the demons in the man and the swine. That's what he had to do, and that was the trick that he did. In my view, as you described it.
Absolutely right. The Greek word that is translated adjure, it's the Greek verb horkizo. Horkizo. Can everybody say that with me? Horkizo. Now, guess what? That is the technical word for exorcism, for driving out a possessing spirit. In other words, the story portrays Jesus and the demon engaged in an exorcistic contest. The demon tries to drive Jesus away. Jesus drives the demon away. They use the language of exorcism, and there's a lesson. There's a meaning in that for us today. The forces of oppression that occupy people's minds and hearts today, they will resist. They will resist the efforts of good-hearted people to help others, we can expect it. The people who told this story had probably experienced rejection and resistance as they tried to continue the liberating work of Jesus. So we can expect resistance from those who want to unfairly control others, who want to profit from others and manipulate them, resistance from selfish politicians. We can expect it.
Larry, oftentimes conservative Christians have said the meaning of the miracles is to validate the claim that Jesus is not just a human being, but that he is the Son of God. And therefore, we can't expect to do miracles like this because we're not divine. And it's just a proof. Well, that's one thing. I'm glad that you rejected that as the meaning. Well, you didn't actually say it, but maybe you want to make a comment about that.
Thank you, Larry. That's a very good point. Not only in this story, but in the next two stories to which we are going to turn, where Jesus' power over the natural world is described, the storytellers and the author of Mark's gospel, they do not use those stories in order to prove Jesus' divinity. Just the opposite.
Yeah.
The focus of those stories is upon whether or not the disciples will have courage, whether they will be faithful in their following of Jesus. So, Larry, your point is a good one. The New Testament authors and the storytellers that have shaped this tradition do not use these stories in order to prove that Jesus is somehow superhuman.
Yeah.
The meaning of the stories for the first storytellers is more personal, more social and political.
And therefore, one of the points is, shall these two institutions given to us by God, church and state, is their purpose to a kind of survival of the fittest, to eliminate those like this man who can at this point can contribute nothing to society, and emphasize those who are strongest. And obviously that was a kind of a Nazi way to look at human beings. And as an illustration of that, the church had such good institutions for caring for people who were epileptic, people who were at maybe the least of these, we might say, from Jesus. And at Bethel Bielefeld, where we had a big institution for caring for epileptics, the Nazis under Hitler wanted to exterminate all of those people because they were not worth feeding when you needed food for the strong people, the super race, the military. And so church and state both seem like they, under God, have an obligation not to care for the strongest because they're fine, but to be a safety net of mercy for those like this man who was in a horrible shape until Jesus liberates him. So not to say that the church can perform miracles like that, but certainly the direction of their efforts is not just for the strong.
Larry, you're absolutely right. over the last 48 hours, I've been furiously reading application files from students from all over the world who want to come to the United States, want to come to Fordham to pursue their education. Many of these students from Ghana, from Nigeria, from Vietnam, they tell heartbreaking stories about the way in which their governments have neglected the weak, have supported the strong. Many of these students lost their parents in internecine warfare and simply through hunger and starvation. So, Larry, I agree completely with what you've said about the church and the state under God. There is a ministry in Nashville, Tennessee, that owes its origin in helping the poor and the homeless to an afternoon. This is a Catholic church, a Catholic parish. One afternoon, the priest looked out the window of his study and saw that the patients, the suffering psychological patients from the local mental hospital had simply been dumped out on the streets of Nashville because the legislature in Tennessee refused to continue funding this mental institution. And so the courtyard of the church, of a Catholic church in Nashville, was full of people that had been dumped by the political process in Tennessee. And it was on that day that the priest and the people resolved to step in and try to help these individuals. And that ministry is still going on. It started in the 1980s, and it's still going today. Now, all of these observations are so perfectly correct, and I'm grateful to all of you. Now, with your permission, I would like to turn to two stories. They're also found in the Gospel of Mark, so the earliest gospel. And the first one is the story of the stilling of the storm. This is Mary. This is part 3 of our course, the so-called nature miracles. And I would like to focus on Mark chapter 4. There it is, verses 35 to 41. On that day, when evening had come, that's a typically vague remark, characteristic of Mark's style of storytelling. They took him, it says, verse 36, they took him with them just as he was in the boat. So the disciples are the actors here. Jesus is the object, rather passive object. They load him into the boat as if he is some sort of cargo, a sack of potatoes. I want you to focus now, as we look for the meaning of this story. I want you to focus upon the disciples as actors. Jesus is the passive object. So the storyteller now is putting the focus on the disciples. How will they respond? It just so happens that in 1986, a first century fishing boat was discovered by archaeologists buried in the Sea of Galilee. It was in good shape. It was because it had been covered by the mud and the silt. It was 27 feet long. and 7.5 feet wide, much like the boat into which Jesus and his disciples would have entered. Now, notice in verse 36, at the end of the verse, the storyteller says that other boats were with him. I wonder, why is that? Why mention other boats? Is that simply a realistic feature of the narrative? Or is the storyteller suggesting that others will be exposed to the dangers of the storm that is gathering around them? Look at verse 37. A great windstorm arose. The Greek word is lilaps. Lilaps. It designates a wind spout over the water, kind of tornado over the sea. Look at verse 38. But he, that is Jesus, was in the stern. Where is the stern of a boat? It's in the back. Yes, he's not in the prow confronting the waves as they beat into the boat. He is in the back, and furthermore, he is asleep. He is asleep on a cushion. The cushion was part of the boat's equipment in fishing boats of that period. It was probably a sandbag that could be used for ballast. And so the disciples, notice how passive Jesus is. He is asleep. The disciples wake him up, and they awaken him rather rudely. They say, "Teacher." Notice that they don't call him Lord. In Matthew's version of this story, printed just below, Matthew chapter 8, verse 25, the disciples are more reverent. They say, "Lord, save us. We are perishing." But in Mark's version, they speak to Jesus in an irreverent way. They say, "Lord, do you not care?" They are accusatory. "Do you not care? We are perishing." And so, waking up, Jesus rebukes the wind. Now, the Greek verb that is translated here, rebuke, is the verb epitimon. Epitimon. And by now you won't be surprised to learn that this verb is also used in exorcism rituals. In other words, the storyteller is suggesting that the storm has something demonic about it. The storm is portrayed as opposed to God. And notice that Jesus uses the language of exorcism in response to the wind and the waves. In our text, what Jesus says is translated, "Be silent, be still." But in Greek, the first verb is siopa, which means be silent. And the second one, pephimoso, be muzzled. Both of these verbs are found in ancient exorcisms, in binding spells, spells that attempt to bind and muzzle a possessing spirit, a demonic force. And then the storyteller says that the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm, galene, megale. And then look at verse 40. Keeping your eyes trained upon the disciples, Jesus says to them, why are you afraid? Have you still no faith? Now, this is interesting, isn't it? The storm has ceased. The wind is no longer howling. The waves are no longer beating into the boat. And yet, the disciples are still what? They are afraid. They are faithless. The disciples are portrayed as fearful and faithless even after Jesus has stilled the storm. And the last verse, verse 41, and they were filled with great fear. The Greek says literally, ephobethes phobon. They feared a great fear. And they said to one another, who is this then, that even the wind and the sea obey him? Now, I don't think this is an expression of awe. No, it is incomprehension. Even though the disciples have experienced the stilling of the storm, they still don't know who Jesus is. Now, we have the text in front of us. Let's begin to search for the meaning of the story for us today. The story portrays Jesus as initially overcome with exhaustion. When evening comes, he wants to get away. He wants to cross over the sea for relief from the crowds that in the preceding text were crushing upon him. Their destination in crossing over the sea is Gentile territory, Gerasa, where he meets the demon-possessed man. Now, in order to successfully draw out the meaning of this story, I think it is important to notice that there are echoes of the Old Testament story of Jonah. There are clear conceptual and even verbal echoes. The story of Jonah lies in the background. Notice all the similarities. When Jonah is told by God to go and prophesy to a Gentile city, Nineveh, where does Jonah go instead? He gets on a boat. And after he gets on the boat, going in the opposite direction from Nineveh, what happens? There is a violent storm at sea, just as in this story. And when the storm is raging, where is Jonah? Do you remember? He is asleep on the boat, and the sailors have to wake him up. Just like the disciples, the sailors in the Jonah narrative are frightened. They're badly frightened. And eventually they cast Jonah overboard. They throw him out of the ship in order to still the storm. And after that, the Jonah story records the bewildered and amazement as response of the sailors. There are not only these motifs in common, but there are even verbal overlaps between the Jonah story and this text. The disciples, for example, say, when they shake Jesus awake, they say, "We are perishing." And that's the same thing that the sailors say in the Jonah story. Also, the expression, "the storm died down." and the expression, they feared a great fear. All of those expressions in the text are exactly the same as the Greek translation of the Jonah story. So the Jonah story lies in the background. And the early tradition of interpretation of this story in the Gospel of Mark already connected this story with baptism. Jesus and his disciples were taken to be a symbol of the church in a time of crisis. And the great North African church father Tertullian, a lawyer who then became a Christian, in his essay on baptism, he refers to this story as a symbol of the church in a time of crisis. One last piece of information, I think, is necessary before we try to draw out the meaning. In the middle of the first century, after the death and resurrection of Jesus, the followers of Jesus in Galilee and in Judea were living in the midst of a gathering storm of war between Rome and the Jewish people. And as the forces of war, the war clouds began to gather on the horizon, Jewish society fractured. It fractured. There were different parties and factions that emerged, often in opposition to one another, like the partisanship in our politics today. So the Sadducees, the aristocracy, the landowners, they hated the zealots, the poor people from the countryside that followed the teaching of Judas of Galilee, a zealot. And then there were the Pharisees and the Essenes. Josephus, the great Jewish historian of this period, he describes the fracturing of Jewish society leading up to the war with Rome. He describes it very graphically. I almost hate to tell you how he describes it. He describes the Jewish society as a piece of meat being torn apart by 4 dogs, by 4 factions. The followers of Jesus were not immune from this time of troubles and anxiety. The Gospel of Mark, chapter 13, verses 9 through 13, Jesus warns his disciples that after he is gone, they will face opposition and persecution. They will be handed over to town councils. They will be beaten with rods in the synagogue. They will be dragged in front of magistrates and governors because they confess Jesus' name. In the Old Testament, in fact, throughout the Old Testament, but especially in the story of Jonah, a storm at sea was frequently a symbol of the terror of a time of crisis. So now I think we are able to draw out the meaning of the story now that we know all of this. Jesus rebukes the storm in the same way that he cast out unclean spirits from those who are possessed. The words siopa and pepimoso are used in binding spells to bind malignant powers. The waves that are beating into the little boat where Jesus and the disciples are, I think they are symbolic. They are narrative symbols of the persecution being experienced by Jesus' followers. And the author implies in several ways that the persecution experienced by Jesus and his followers has its ultimate source in demonic power, a power that is opposed to God. Finally, the story ends with a dialogue between Jesus and the disciples. After conquering the external dangers, Jesus then turns to the internal danger, the danger of the disciples' fear and their faithlessness. Jesus asks, "Why are you so cowardly? Why do you still have no faith?" Okay, here's the meaning that I draw out of this story. Jesus' response to the disciples at the end of the story is placed alongside the disciples' anxious question to Jesus. Look at chapter 4, verse 38 again. The disciples say what? "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And now look at chapter 4, verse 40. Jesus responds, "Why are you cowardly? Don't you have faith yet?" In other words, the human challenge to God in this story, the human challenge to Jesus is, don't you care? Oh God, don't you care about the crisis that we are experiencing, the dangerous time in which we are living? And the response of Jesus to all of us is, why are you still faithless? Now, class, what I want to say is that both questions are real questions. They both reflect realities, alternative realities. On the other hand, our feeling of desperation in the face of a crisis, the desperate human situation. I don't know about you, my friends and colleagues, but I wake up in this little apartment here in the Bronx and I turn on the news in the morning and I see the terrible, savage war going on in Gaza, the terrible, savage war in the Ukraine. I see the hostility and partisanship between people in our country, the suffering of the poor, the suffering of people that are fleeing desperate situations, looking for a better life. I wake up and see all of that in the news, and I'm tempted to be like the disciples in this story. I'm tempted to turn my eyes up to heaven and to ask, don't you care? It reflects a reality, the desperate human situation. On the other hand, there is an alternative reality, and it is the one found in Jesus' question. Don't you have courage yet? Why are you still faithless? So the ultimate issue for us, I think, the ultimate issue at stake is, which one of these two perceptions of reality will guard and guide our lives? Which one? Will fear and doubt guide our lives? Fear and doubt is natural. It is human, all too human. But we have someone with us in the midst of the storm. We have someone in the boat with us. And so there is an alternative reality. It is the reality of courage, of confidence, of faithfulness. The great German Old Testament scholar, Larry Hofsis, Julius Wellhausen, who was at your university, Heidelberg, at one time, back at the beginning of the 20th century, Julius Wellhausen said that when Jesus is portrayed as sleeping in the midst of the storm, the storyteller is trying to give us a picture of Jesus' total confidence. He is able to sleep because he has placed his confidence in an alternative reality. But I'd like to come back to the disciples' final question, the question that they keep asking themselves repeatedly. Who is this, that even the winds and the sea obey him? Now, what this reveals is that whatever faith the disciples have, it is still provisional. They do not yet place their confidence in Jesus. They don't yet know that he can be trusted. They don't know who he is. Could he be the bringer of a new world, a new reality? Is he ultimately capable of defeating the watery chaos? Is he able, if you put your trust, is he able to lead us to face the demons of the forces around us? Of course, because we have just celebrated Martin Luther King Day, I find myself recalling what Martin Luther King said on the last night of his life when he addressed a congregation in Memphis, Tennessee, and he said that he had experienced death threats. He said, like any man, I've experienced fear. Like any man, I would like to live. And then, class, do you remember? He said, but I have been to the mountaintop and I have seen the promised land. And I may not get there with you, but I know that we as a people will get to the promised land. So it's that kind of ability to place one's confidence in the ultimate victory of God over the watery chaos. It is our trust and our faith in that reality that enables us to ride through the storm. Well, that's the meaning that I draw out of this story. Now, my good wife Diane instructed me today to keep the telephone beside me on the desk so that I could check when I was getting to the end of the hour. And I have obeyed my instructions. A little bit too late, I'm afraid, Diane, but I see that it is now 9:55. So let me stop here. I'm sorry we don't get to go on to the next story, the story of Jesus walking upon the water. But we will come back. We will come back to that next week. We will come back to the story of the feeding of the 5,000. But let me stop here and ask for final thoughts.
Larry, John
Yes,
Beckman.
please.
John Beckman, I've always been puzzled in this section. The one hand, at the end here in verse 41, the disciples are, who is this guy that can do all this stuff? But in verse 38, it's almost as, hey, why don't you wake up and do something? I don't see, it seems like the two ideas they don't fit together. On the one hand, they think he can do it. Why don't you wake up and do something? And on the other hand, they say, well, who is this guy that can do this?
Yes.
I don't get the.
Look, Larry, I might have an explanation for that. Storms in that part of the world rose rapidly and were very violent. And if there was the least sign of a storm, you got your boat to shore wherever you could to save yourself and your equipment. And I would be willing to offer that Jesus wanted to go to the other side in spite of the weather. And they said, well, that's where their faith came in. And they got out in the middle of the water, and it was so violent, they were afraid they were going to die, and Jesus was sleeping. And so you take those two things together, and therein lies the miracle of Jesus calming the storm. He was ready for that. He was gonna, it was an opportunity to show his power over nature. Because if you go to the Sea of Galilee, today the storms there are very violent because it's shallow and the wind is prevailing from the east, so it's terrible.
Pete, you're exactly right, and thank you for supplying that detail from the context. The other place that I'm familiar with where storms come up very quickly and put lives in danger is Arkansas, where I grew up. And Pete, once in my life, I actually saw a lilacs, a waterspout, a tornado over the water. I'm ashamed to admit the reason I saw it was that I'd gone fishing with my old college roommate and we played hooky. We skipped class in order to go fishing on Heber Springs Lake. So Pete, that's a good observation. John, coming back to the tension that you've noticed in the story, in the way the disciples are portrayed. You're right, John. That's very perceptive. I think the incongruity, the inconsistency in their behavior is characteristic of the way that we as human beings confront desperate situations. We don't respond logically or consistently. Whenever I find myself filled with anxiety and fear after the storm has passed and somehow God has sustained me, I find myself singing that old Christian hymn, "If Thou But Trust in God to Guide Thee." You know that song? So I think the portrait of the disciples here as reflecting the desperation and the fearfulness of the human situation. The author of this story does not spare the disciples. They are not portrayed as heroes. And I'm glad that the storyteller told the truth about the disciples. Mary, I see that my time is gone, and I know that some are called to service in the choir. Thank you all so much for today. Next Sunday, God willing, guess where I will be? I will be in Dayton. I will be at Epiphany, enjoying your presence in person. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in person in 1 week.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Larry.
Thanks to everybody for good observation.